I've got a really interesting story for you. Now, this is one that flew under my radar. I didn't even know this had actually happened, but apparently this was like a few months ago, so that's why I'm talking about it now, because I wasn't aware that it even happened. You know, Jose Mari Sison, the guy who runs the Communist Party of the Philippines living in exile. Now, he recently made a very interesting post that has Western Maoists very angry. Look at this. When we review this post and what exactly he said, Mr. Sison is really starting to sound like a third worldist. He said, in the industrial capitalist countries, the proletarian revolutionaries cannot begin the Revolutionary War with a small and weak people's army in the countryside and hope to use the wide space and indefinite time in the countryside to sustain the war. As soon as that army dares to launch the first tactical offensive, it will be overwhelmed by the huge armed army and the highly unified economic, communications, and transport system of the monopoly bourgeoisie. However, the term People's War may be flexibly used to mean necessary armed revolution by the people to overthrow the bourgeois state in an industrial capitalist country. But definitely, what ought to be protracted is the preparation for armed revolution with the overwhelming participation of the people. So essentially what he's saying is that if you're running around LARPing that you're doing revolution, you're not really doing it. Now, there are many so-called Red Guard organizations in the United States who very loudly proclaim themselves to be doing People's War when they certainly are not. And the Revolutionary Communist Party of Canada, which claims to be engaged in People's War right now, from their bookstore and not having fired a shot, and call it like a tactical defensive or some other mental gymnastics like that. In a roundabout way, Sison is calling out these LARPers without directly attacking them because he kind of needs their support. And it's very interesting where he goes with this. Let me continue. It is futile to ignite armed revolution in the city or the countryside without due regard to the objective conditions and subjective factors of the revolution. An urban armed insurrection against the capitalist state can only succeed as a result of a grave destabilization by its internal crisis, the crisis of the world capitalist system, involvement in an inter-capitalist or inter-imperialist war, and the rise of the revolutionary mass movement with sufficient armed struggle. Well, Mr. Sison, you're sounding very much like a third worldist there. This is almost exactly the argument that we make with regards to the material conditions within the first world. He's outright saying, yeah, you're not going to have a revolution in the first world until there's a major economic crisis. And anything you do until then, any kind of alleged radical action isn't going to accomplish anything. And that you should be focusing your efforts on preparing for it rather than running around LARPing that you're doing it. That's very, very interesting that he should suddenly decide to say something like this. But then he also continues. It is also unwise to bring arms to mass protests that are supposed to be legal and peaceful, and where most of the people are unarmed and are far from ready to launch an armed insurrection. It is wise for the Revolutionary Party of the Proletariat not to publicly declare the intent of building a people's army before the conditions are ripe for armed revolution. This is a direct criticism of Maoists in the First World who allege that they are doing People's War. I'm talking about the various Red Guard groups. I'm not referring to the I'm not referring to the Austin Red Guards because they've already been basically exposed as COINTELPRO. There's a big backstory for that beyond the scope of this video. But he's basically telling them, when you go to these protests with guns and you act like you're doing something, you're really not. And in fact, you kind of look cringy. As we recall with some of the previous protests where these Maoists brought guns, they had to be protected by the police from alt-right counter-protesters because there were so few of these so-called, mass Maoist Red Guards. He's outright saying you're wasting your time doing that and you're just going to get your ass targeted by police, and that you should be focusing on more productive things like better organizing and waiting until there's actually conditions for revolution, which is the one thing that First Worldists don't like to acknowledge. There is no basis for revolution in the First World right now. There are people who need revolution. There's no doubt about that. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about the objective conditions for creating revolution. And they're not there. When you show up to somebody else's protest with a gun and they tell you to leave or they try to disassociate from you, that's a pretty good sign that they're not down with armed struggle. But the real story here is Sison taking this not completely third worldist stance, but a very heavy shift towards a third worldist stance. Now, I have been very critical of Sison in the past, like calling Duterte the Filipino Hugo Chavez, which was really very strange. He did that during the election because Duterte said, oh, we can have a peace agreement with the rebels. So Sison started pandering to him. He started saying, oh, look how he's so great. He's in peace. He really understands the Filipino people. He's the Filipino Hugo Chavez. Yeah. And then he started murdering innocent people for simply being addicted to drugs, and created possibly one of the worst police states that exist in the world today, with a great deal of extrajudicial killings. Good one. And not to mention the desire to make a peace agreement that would end the People's War. You know that's the opposite of doing revolution, right? When you put guns down and stop fighting, that's the opposite of picking up guns and fighting. But given the mental gymnastics of First Worldists, they tend to defend him on this, saying it's temporary or some other kind of, like I said, mental gymnastics to try to justify this. But this pseudo-third worldist position that he's starting to take, this has them angered. And nobody is angered more by this than the Norwegian Maoists, who are denouncing him for that and declaring their support for the universality of People's War. Now, I do not believe that People's War is universal. You couldn't claim that and be a third worldist. Those two things would run in direct contradiction with each other. Now, there may be an ulterior motive by Sison for holding this position. Maybe. There has been a lot of question lately on him being extradited back to the Philippines to be charged with various crimes by the Philippine government, and maybe this is his way of trying to shore up his status as protected. Well, I'm not asking for revolution in the first world. I'm not a threat to you, but I have to support revolution there where all the bad people are. That could be what he's doing. I don't know. I'm not inside his head. But that is one possible explanation for what he's doing. But even aside from that, it's very interesting that he's suddenly taking this quasi-third worldist stance. And while I still do denounce him for his reactionary stances and his desire to abandon armed struggle in favor of a peace negotiation to accomplish I'm not sure what, I still find this all very interesting, and I definitely will be keeping an eye on seeing where this goes.
Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.